Hello internet, welcome to the channel. My name's Frankie, and in today's video we're going to be battling with some financial issues across the park, and we're going to be introducing the African elephant in an even better elephant habitat than what we've built previously on the channel. So, for those of you that have been subscribed to the channel for a little while now, you may remember the elephant habitat in Little Asia, our first franchise mode zoo. Well, whilst building this African elephant habitat, I wanted to improve on that. So we're going to take some of the issues from that previous habitat and fix them. Namely, we had a rather square habitat, which now I'm not too fond of. I want this new one to be quite fluid in its shape. We also had the barriers be made from pre-made barriers, but I want a custom one for this habitat. And we also used a blueprint-made shelter for the elephants, but for these wonderful beasts, I want to make one from scratch. Now, the first thing that I did in order to prepare for this habitat was to figure out how big it needed to be and then mark it out using some building materials. On the Zoopedia page for your chosen animal, you can alter how many animals are going to be in it, and then it will give you a minimum habitat requirement for the land area needed. So I went on to the African Savannah Elephant page and inputted 4 adults, as I thought that would probably be around the number of elephants that I'd be starting with. The first step to figuring out how to mark out your habitat is to figure out the total area needed, and to do that you just want to add the land requirement and the water requirement. Next up, we need to find out how big the perimeter of this habitat is, and to do that you need to press the square root button and then input your total area of the habitat. This will then give you a result which is your perimeter in meters. And now that we have the total perimeter of our habitat, we can divide that by 4 in order to figure out how long each side needs to be. And that is if you're going to be building a square to mark out your habitat, which is what I would suggest you do. The result from that last equation will tell you how long each side of your habitat needs to be, and how you make that up is up to you. For me, I then divide it by 4 again so that I can just use that many 4-meter long pieces. And using that equation is exactly how I got the layout for this habitat. It allows you to know exactly how big this needs to be before you actually start to design it, which is great because you oftentimes can put an animal in your habitat and it just be too small. We'd rather go too big. So if you ever get some decimal points in the equations, just round up. It's always best to have a little bit extra space than not enough. As I said earlier, one of the main things I want to change from what I did with the Indian elephant habitat is that I don't want this habitat to be square. So whilst I've marked it out using a square to begin with, I'm now going to use the sand painting tool to mark out where I want this habitat to be in a more fluid shape. We have our minimum here. This square tells us exactly how much space we need to have in order to keep the animals happy. So as long as I don't make it smaller than that shape, we are all good. And now that I've decided on the actual shape of our habitat, I'm going to start doing some terrain alterations because I want this to appear kind of like an island. You see it very often in zoos that elephants are kept quite far away from the guests and they kind of appear to be on an island. And that is because normally there is a ditch or a trough kind of area right in front of where the guests stand. And that's so that you are above the elephants and that they can't just climb out and you can't interact with them either. So what I'm going to be doing is building a kind of island that they will primarily do all of their stuff on, and then nearer the guest viewing area will be filled with water. It'll be a nice swimming area for them. Next, I want to start building our custom barrier, and I want to go for quite a natural looking one in this habitat. In some of my previous enclosures, like for instance the beavers spring to mind straight away, I have a very natural looking habitat barrier, and I want to kind of mimic that with the African elephants. So what I'm going to do is use 2 mud wall pieces just so that I have something to kind of build on top of, and then I'm going to use various rocks from the appropriate biomes, which are desert and grassland from the continent of Africa. And I'm going to use the thin square-like rocks that you would kind of just put near piles of rocks. At least that's how I primarily use them. And then I'm going to create a staggered effect to slowly cover this entire wall. And that will mask the mud wall that we put in place. We're just using that as kind of a frame to build upon. And then we can copy and paste the whole thing and just slowly go round the perimeter of our habitat, making this our wall. Now, I'm also going to be mixing up the types of rocks that I use in this barrier. I don't want it to just be desert rocks, and I don't want it to just be the really bright rocks either. We're going to mix it up and have a lot of colour variation here. When I've got this barrier section complete, it really is just a matter of copy and pasting it around the perimeter of the habitat and adjusting the height to kind of follow the height of the ground or surface that it is placed upon. It's also worth noting that I keep my original wall piece off to the side so that I can come back to it and copy and paste it if need be, rather than getting lost in amongst all the pieces that I'm placing down now. We have one just set aside to be used at any point that we need it. At the rear of the habitat, I've left a little bit of space open, and we're going to alter the terrain a little bit so that we have somewhere to place our habitat house, as we want it to be quite large and not take up too much space within the actual habitat. So I'm just adding on a little section at the back for that purpose. You can also see that I've added the water to the dip at the front of the habitat. I wanted to make sure that I had a really smooth transition from our raised area into the water so that it wasn't too steep and the animals aren't going to fall or tumble. It's a nice safe decline into, which is a very, very popular spot for elephants, the waterhole. It was around this point that I realised that the finances of the park really weren't doing too well. Every month we were losing money rather than gaining it. So one way of trying to combat this was to add some exhibits. I decided to go for the African exhibit blueprints and just add a couple in front of where this elephant habitat is. If we get the right animals in here, they can breed pretty quickly and we can sell on the excess animals and get a little bit of extra income. I'm also going to need to reduce some of the staff wages, fire some staff that we don't actually need because I've been over hiring as this goes. I'm also going to change the prices in a lot of our shops, and I'm also going to sell a lot of animals. Well, actually, it would have been smart to sell them, get a bit of money, but I just kept releasing them to the wild because I can't bring myself to sell them. For some reason, for me, they need to go back to the wild. So that was an opportunity to make money, but it didn't really. But by decreasing the number of animals in our zoo, the food cost, the cost it has to feed all these animals, reduces dramatically as well. So these are just a few ways that I went about reducing the costs or the outgoings in our zoo, because at this point in time, it was really bad, and a lot of this stuff was actually done after the elephant habitat build because I hadn't quite figured it out that decreasing the food grade for the animals will save you a lot of money as well. That is something that I did after we'd finished building the elephant habitat, as we actually got down to only having a few £100s left, and that is obviously very bad given that in a couple videos previous to this one we had a few £100,000. So we really needed to change things about. I don't like that I've had to decrease the quality of the food for the animals, but you know, sometimes things just have to be done. So what you can see me doing here is just building this exhibit area, making sure we've got some African animals in there, and there is a fourth one which I need to fill, so I end up just popping a tarantula in there because they're exciting to see at the zoo. With the money situation hopefully improving, it was time to build our elephant's habitat house. And what I decided to do was use some breeze block wall pieces and build a tall pillar from them, because I wanted to create a dome-like habitat house, loosely inspired by the elephant house at Copenhagen Zoo. They have a large oval-like habitat house with a glass roof, and that's exactly what I wanted to do. I'm not going to add all the details inside that they do have, but I was loosely inspired by what they were doing. So I used the breeze block pieces as our main wall, and then I ran some metal beams up the side for a bit of structural support, and then we use a glass roof at the top. Now, to do this, to make an oval building, we need to build it exactly the same as we would when building a circular building. So we need to create one wall and then a roof piece as well that we want to arch over. We can then copy and paste it to create kind of an arch or a bridge sort of shape, Make sure that it's spaced exactly how you like it. From there, you can rotate these pieces together to create a perfect circle. Now, the difference with creating a cylinder is once you've created, not cylinder, sorry, an oval, once you've created your circle, you need to delete half of it. You can then copy and paste that to create the other end of your oval. Then all you need to do is copy and paste your initial archway kind of building piece, the thing that you started with to create the circle in the first place. You copy and paste that along, that will create the centerpiece of your oval, and you will have a nice ovular kind of habitat house. And once I was happy with the general shape of this habitat house, it was just a matter of moving it into that area that I created at the back of our habitat for our animals to sleep peacefully. However, I didn't actually measure the size of the gap when I first started building this, so it could have been too large, but coincidentally it fits perfectly. It actually turned out to be the perfect size. Of course, in order to make sure our animals can actually get in here, we're going to delete a few wall pieces, and that is nothing major. All we need to then do is use a few more metal beams to make sure that that kind of lintel area is supported and not just hanging blocks ready to crumble down on top of our elephants. And now that the habitat house is in place, we can also use more of the wall pieces we made earlier, just to make sure there's no gap between the perimeter of our habitat and the animal shelter. Otherwise, our elephants will be out running amok and it will cause a huge problem. Something you commonly see in elephant habitats in zoos is large logs sunk into the ground to act as kind of a barrier to stop them going to certain areas of their habitat they shouldn't be going to. This can be used in habitats where you've got larger animals like rhinos alongside smaller animals such as gazelle or something, and you don't want them to have to share space all the time because rhinos can get quite angry. They have very poor eyesight, so they get easily agitated by things that are close to them. So having an area that only the smaller animal can get to and the large animal can't is a good way of just kind of, keeping a peace. As for why it's in elephant habitats, I've just gone on about the rhinos, and I'm not entirely sure why it's in elephant habitats, to be fair. But I thought I'd put some near the entrance to our habitat house, just because it looks kind of cool. After adding a bunch of straw bedding to the sleeping area, it's time to start with the enrichment. And firstly, we want to make sure this habitat is well heated. These are African elephants, so they need heaters. I'm going to sink these just below the surface of the ground, mainly because I don't like how they look, and hiding them this way means they still work perfectly fine, but you don't have to put up with the ugly look of them. Next up is the food enrichment items, and we want these to be kind of near the front of the habitat as always, so that the guests get the best view. And then the toys are going to be littered about everywhere, basically. The more you spread out your enrichment items, the more likely it is that your animals will use the entirety of the habitat provided to them. I'm also going to use the massive skittle things that are provided to make a bowling alley. They can run at these skittles and knock them over if they want, have a little bit of fun. I did it for the sea lions and they seem to love it, so I'm going to do exactly the same for the elephants. The next enrichment item I'm placing is the waterfall with the metal frame, and I really don't like this piece. I think it looks quite ugly and it annoys me when I have to use it in order to please our animals. So for this habitat, I'm going to try to mask it a little bit. Now, the first step to doing this is, at the moment, it's on land, but it needs somewhere for the water to land. So I'm going to create a small little pond here that we can then join to our main water source in the form of a waterfall. I'm not going to go into too much detail into how I do this, as it's kind of a simple process, but if you do want to figure out how to make waterfalls, I have a video on that I will pop in a card above or in the description below. Now, the key to making this waterfall look slightly better than it normally does is going to be rocks. Using the same flat style rocks that we use to create the barrier, I'm going to create a few little pillars that we can then put over the top of those metal beams, masking them and making them look a little bit more natural. It's really similar to how we made the walls. We're using the exact same rock types, these little square ones. We're making sure random rotates on so that they're going to be appearing in different rotations rather than looking so copy and pasty, we're going to be changing the types of rocks as well in terms of the biome in which they come from, so that we're getting some color variation. And then we are literally just going to pop them over the top of the metal to kind of mask it and make it look a lot more natural. And whilst we're playing about with rocks, it's time to start adding some rocky outcrops, and that is mainly going to be where the water starts. We want a few different clusters of different sizes of rocks, and we're just going to add these kind of all over the place, mainly near the water source, because we're going to use some very specific rocks in a second when it comes to adding plants. With the arrival of our beautiful elephants, of which we have 3, 1 male, 2 females, we are going to start to change the terrain distribution, as these guys like a lot of short grass and a fair bit of soil, because they're going to want to have their mud baths. Speaking of which, it is time to add exactly that, the mud bath. Now, if you've been watching my channel for a little while now, you'll know how I normally deal with mud baths and foraging pits, and that is to mask the wooden frame with various types of rock. However, I went looking about in the game settings and found that if you turn on disable scenery collision and disable terrain collision, you can actually alter the terrain directly around the mud pit, which means that you can then pull the terrain up slightly to entirely mask that wooden frame and really smoothly blend the mud pit into the terrain you already have. Then it's just a matter of painting that area using the mud or dirt, heavy soil paintbrush, and it just looks amazing and natural. So I'm definitely going to be doing this going forward. Now it's time to start adding some plants to this habitat, and if you've seen elephants in a zoo before, you may have noticed there aren't really that many plants in their habitat, and that is because these animals will basically just destroy anything in sight. So in order to have a couple trees in this habitat, what I'm going to do is use quite tall ones where the branches don't actually branch out until quite high up on the tree, and then we are going to surround them with rocks, ensuring that the animals can't actually get to the tree trunk. They might be able to reach up and grab a branch or something, but for the most part these trees are going to be safe. As for the rest of the habitat, we're going to primarily focus on either tall grasses such as the elephant grass or large bushes. That is going to be the main way we cover this habitat. After I'd placed all of the plant life, I then decided to play about with some African branches from the construction tab, just to create a small kind of pile of twigs that I could then litter around the habitat, because these animals are going to be playing with stuff like this. They're going to be breaking branches off trees and whatnot and just throwing them about. So I thought it looked kind of cool to have some discarded piles of twigs. And after that, it was time to focus a little bit more on our guests. Now, they didn't really have a way of viewing our animals. I had created a path that I wasn't very happy with. So what I've decided to do was go to the front of the habitat and raise the ground. Make so that there's a nice smooth incline that they can walk up and get to the right level. All I'm doing is flattening to foundation at a height that I'm happy with to create a kind of risen area that I can then smooth out into the basic ground level below. Then I can run a path really nice and tight, nice and up close to the habitat barrier, right up along this risen area. But with the path being so close to the habitat edge, it does mean that any of our guests could just launch themselves in to play with the elephants, which would be obviously not ideal. So what I decided to do was use some of the African branches. The decorated ones are going to add as some fence posts, and then the super curly, curvy, wavy kind of branches are going to be the bits of wood that would normally kind of bridge the gap between the fence posts. Normally they're going to be straight, but I thought it'd be fun to have these really erratically shaped ones bridging that gap to add a bit of character to this fence. And then when I'm happy with it, I can just copy it and paste it along the front of the habitat. Now at the bottom of this sloped viewing gallery where our exhibits lay, we are going to make it quite natural. I'm going to be using plants that would be found in the elephant's environment without the constrictions of its coverage needs. Because it's quite restrictive, we're going to just go wild here because it's not actually in the habitat. So I'm going to cover this area in plants and have a few rocky outcrops where we can put some elephant statues on to let our guests know that that is what they're about to see. And with the final placement of a few benches and bins to make sure that our guests have a nice area to sit when watching these mammoths, well, not literally mammoths, but you know, their descendants. With that, this habitat was complete. Thank you so very much for having watched this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider giving it a thumbs up and maybe subscribing to the channel to see more videos like this appearing in your subscription feed. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.